Something that's been going on in Hollywood for decades is that whenever a studio is out of good ideas, they decided to make a sequel, prequel, maybe a remake of something else. And this is something that is pretty universally, I'm not saying necessarily it's always hated by fans of the original, but it's usually looked at as kind of a cheap excuse of the studio to try to just capitalize on something that they own the rights to. But in recent years, studios have started to learn that if you put certain demographics front and center in their new property, especially if you're going to do like a race swap or a gender swap or something like that, well, then suddenly you'll get a large segment of the audience and even the media themselves run into the defense of them, because any criticism over this new property will obviously have to be a criticism over having these various groups in it. Even though we know now when it comes to a lot of the major franchises, studios have even said it themselves, people are just getting tired of superhero movies and other things like that. With Star Wars, they've said there's Star Wars fatigue going on. But despite all this and kind of acknowledging on the one hand that, yeah, maybe people just don't like what we're putting out, even some outlets going so far as to say, yeah, Disney has not handled Star Wars in the best way that they could have handled it. Some media outlets are still trying to defend other major studios like this. And just the day after Variety decided to run this puff piece on Rachel Zegler because she's the star of Disney's upcoming Snow White film, and that movie is being reported to have cost $500 million for Disney. So that's something they need to succeed. Now Variety is running this article today talking about how toxic fans are actually destroying Hollywood or something like that. Or basically just saying that toxic fans are the reason that a lot of these franchises are starting to fail, as if they're not failing because they're just of subpar quality. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole article, but I found some interesting points in it. And honestly, their argument only works on the surface. It feels like it was written by just pulling out just Twitter responses and things like that, trying to defend some of these franchises, because as soon as you just start thinking about them in any critical sense, they really just fall apart. But let's look at what they have to say in this one. Sometimes toxic fandoms behave reactively. A House of the Dragon episode featuring 2 female characters kissing and an episode of The Last of Us focusing on a gay couple were both review bombed. The practice of mobbing sites like Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb with negative user reviews, which gained mainstream attention following the premiere of 2017 Star Wars The Last Jedi. And this is an excuse they always try to make whenever something's poorly received. Never mind the fact that it really just falls apart whenever you try to think about it. Because if people were just trying to give negative scores to franchises because they hate the franchise or whatever, then you would see that with every piece of media that's put out from that franchise. But that's not the case. It's only certain things get such negative reaction to it. Never mind the fact, too, that they don't care when critics do the exact same thing. Like when you see something put out in theaters or on TV, especially if it has a political message to it that runs contrary to what the critics personally like, you'll see audiences overwhelmingly love it. Meanwhile, a bunch of critics will go out of their way to give it a negative score and try to make it seem like it's a lot worse received. And there's also the love bombing, too, from people who are going on to these sites to try to give it a positive score. We saw a coordination for the Acolyte on social media where people were saying to go to Rotten Tomatoes and give it a positive score. I made videos talking about it in the past where people will actually create brand new accounts. You can look at some of the user reviews on that. A brand new account reviewed nothing else but gave the Acolyte a perfect score on there because they were trying to drive up the score. But a lot of these media outlets don't care about that. They only care when it's negative reaction. And I'm not saying it never happens that way. Mostly what happens is people are just motivated because they have a strong reaction to the material that they're watching. So if you see it overwhelmingly a negative score, then that usually means the audience is overwhelmingly disliking it. And bringing up stuff like House of the Dragon and The Last of Us to try to insinuate people were just upset because they're gay people in it. It's like, that wasn't it entirely. When it came to House of the Dragon, the only real criticism was from Middle Eastern countries for that episode. Maybe there was some domestically, but for the most part, what I saw was people just complaining in Middle Eastern countries, and that's because they throw people like that off of buildings in those areas of the world. And as far as The Last of Us, people didn't care with a gay character in the games also being a gay character on the show. What people were critical of the show about was, up to that point, it was pretty good on staying faithful to the games. Obviously, it was being adapted for a different medium, but it was following it pretty closely. Then the 3rd episode came around and it deviated really dramatically. And people really didn't like that approach to it. I mean, I'm not saying it was necessarily a bad episode, but the game itself had a lot more action-packed sequences that I think would have been more interesting than what we actually got on the screen. And I wish they would have followed that more closely, but they decided not to do that. But despite all this, people try to always spin it to make it seem like these are the groups of people. And it's what I was talking about, where they'll just put in certain demographics in their movies and TV shows and things like that. So whenever people criticize it, they can just use that as a shield. And to me, I think that's kind of patronizing that they're doing that sort of thing. But that's just how things work, apparently. Still, toxic fandoms have grown so pernicious that they've become a fact of life for many, and so powerful that while talent, executives, and publicists will privately bemoan the issue, fear of inadvertently triggering another backlash kept several studios from speaking for this story, even on background. Unfortunately, that's advice that not all actors seem to listen to, even if they probably should. The Acolyte is a prime example of all that, because in the lead up to the release of The Acolyte, you saw most people just criticizing Leslie Headland because she's the former personal assistant to Harvey Weinstein, and she's the showrunner for The Acolyte. Amanda Lestenberg decided, though, she wanted to jump into the fray, and she started off by releasing that diss track calling anyone who was critical over the show ists and phobe. And at that point, she decided to jump into the fight. So people were like, well, okay, fine. If you're going to get involved with the fight, then now you're involved with the fight. And people start attacking her. Never mind the fact that we didn't really see the same reaction to some of the other actors in The Acolyte. In fact, a lot of the response to some of the other actors were just like, you know what? I feel kind of sorry for them because they're stuck in a crappy show. They're trying to do the best with what they have, and it just isn't going to work out for them. But for Amanda Lestenberg, people were attacking her because she was pretty vicious to them, so they had to respond accordingly. Now, I will admit, because I don't know all the stuff that was said to her on social media, I'm just assuming that some of it was probably pretty egregious because, it's the internet and people are nasty to each other on the internet. I mean, I was called all kinds of racist and sexist slurs since I was a kid jumping on the internet. I mean, that's just a fact of life. I mean, it's not a good thing, but that's just the way it is. I don't really take it personally or anything like that. I mean, if people are going to make actual legitimate threats, well, then I'll respond accordingly and report it to the authorities. And if people are making threats to Amanda Lestenberg or anyone working on these projects, then yeah, you should report them to the police because don't do that. And I would also try to encourage people not to be overly nasty to individuals, even if they initiate it, because, just stick to their work. If they're doing a bad job, criticize their work and their performance. Don't necessarily criticize them. But either way, like I said, and like this article says, if you try to kind of avoid that confrontation, then usually the reception is a lot better. Or better yet, if you acknowledge it and try to be understanding with it. Madam Web is a good example of that because that was something that wasn't well received. And instead of seeing actresses like Dakota Johnson or Sydney Sweeney trying to attack people as sexist for not liking it, they were just kind of like, yeah, the movie wasn't very good after all, was it? Sorry, we did our best. It just didn't work. And a lot of people were like, yeah, the movie wasn't good, but at least I can respect you for acknowledging that and understanding that there was problems with it. And people were pretty positive response to both of them as a result of all that. And I'm just wondering what would have happened with Amanda Lestenberg if she took that approach to everything as opposed to trying to antagonize the fan base by making it seem like only racist and sexist or homophobes or whatever wouldn't like The Acolyte. I think she would have been more endeared to the fan base if she would have been like, yeah, you kind of have some points, but just give us a chance. I think people would be more inclined to actually do that. The whole saying you catch more flies with honey than vinegar sort of thing. Maybe they should take that approach with it. Some studios are starting to acknowledge that. That's why this article even says that they're starting to bring in some focus groups to try to understand what issues people have with certain media and how they can actually fix it. In addition to a standardized focus group testing, studios will assemble a specialized cluster of superfans to assess possible marketing materials for a major franchise project. And I think moves like that just goes to show, despite what some of these studios are trying to claim, they understand that criticism for them isn't necessarily just toxic fans, and that's why they're trying to listen to them. Now, this is just like they say for marketing purposes, so it's too far along in the project, I think, to make any meaningful change. I think the best thing would be to bring them on in the early phases just to kind of get people an idea of the script and like what they're doing with it, to try to see if they actually like it or if changes should be made at that stage. But, baby steps and all that. Another thing why this article I think is just completely bunk is because if it was just people trying to just knock down a franchise like they're claiming, then it would be everything within that franchise and not just the ones that actually have legitimate grievances against them. But if people are really hating the MCU, then you would see everything within the MCU in recent years failing. But you get Deadpool and Wolverine, for instance, and that was a huge success for them. But I know people are probably going to say it's like, well, that's because it was straight white men leading it. And that's the reason why it was so successful. If it was strong female characters or non-white characters or gay couples or anything like that, then it would have failed. But look at House of the Dragon, for instance. Game of Thrones had a pretty bad ending to that. House of the Dragon came out. They have strong female characters leading it. They have race swap characters in it. They have homosexual couples in that. No one cares because the acting's good. The story and writing is good for it. The effects are decent. So people like that show, even though it had all the reasons in the world for you would think these toxic fans to try to review bomb it. They didn't because it was actually a well put together show. And that's one thing we're seeing with a lot of these projects that get review bombed like they're trying to claim, is that it's just stuff that actually has legitimate criticism to it and things that need to be fixed. And if studios want to go back to making money, then maybe they should start listening to this criticism and to actually try to understand that the fans aren't just toxic and racist or whatever they're trying to claim. The fans actually have insight into it and they're saying, this is what we wanted. You didn't give us this, so we're going to tell you. And studios, it's up to them. They can either listen to what the fans are saying or they can continue just dismissing them entirely and doing whatever they want and losing money as a result. It's really their decision right now, but let me know what you think about all this in the comment section below. And also, if you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with the latest entertainment news. And don't forget to click that like button and share this video out there because it really helps out with the channel. Thank you.